Now, the reason I'm here is that the second that the Range Rover chassis is gleaming and ready for parts, I'm going to want to bolt those parts on. Obviously, we know we're going to be replacing things like the springs and the shock absorbers, but these axles are going to have to be refurbished before we even think about getting them near a new shiny chassis. So we can't just paint them, we need to actually do a load of checks, make sure there's no wear in any of the moving parts, and obviously we know that the seals are leaking, so they need to be replaced as well. Now, to give me a hand, I've got one of Brit Parts experts, Steve.
Hello.
Good to see you, sir. Now, obviously, these are not in terrible state, are they? But I mean, I guess you've probably seen worse. I'm hoping you've seen worse.
I have seen a lot worse, yes. I've seen cases rotted through and that, so these are fairly good for what I've seen so far.
Yeah, well, they hold oil in this area, they just kind of leak it out the edges.
They're leaking out the seals at the moment in various places. As you say, the brakes and that all need looking at and freeing off, so.
Okay, but then I guess the first thing before we can do anything else, really, to check the real important bits of the actual, the diff itself, I guess we want to drop all the oil, right?
Yes, yeah, if we drop the oil out, the oil will tell us a multitude of sins for starters, whether there's been mud in there, water in there and whatever.
Chunks of metal, that
Chunks of metal is a bad sign as well, yes.
Now obviously the front is a bit more complicated, so I think we'll just ease ourselves into this by starting on the rear axle. Oh. Right, let's have a look. So, right, we're looking at this. You can actually see it's a little bit milky, so there's obviously a tiny bit of moisture in there.
Yeah, there's no water coming out initially, first of all, so that's a good sign.
Yeah,
it's not settled.
And to be fair, John does generally wash this in a Ford after he's been off-roading. I say does, but obviously like 12 years ago. So it's 12-year-old water anyway, for one thing, but also looking at that, just whizzing it around, I can't see any chunks of metal in there either.
There's no shiny bits in it at all to suggest any sort of adverse wear and tear. So.
Cool, and it just smells as unpleasant as this gearbox all does anyway, doesn't it?
Always does, yeah. The older it is, the worse it is.
All right, so that's good. So our first stage really is basically the oil's okay, so there's not too much metal in there, then it means that there's a chance that actually that kind of backlash is actually just things, maybe the bearings.
Wear and tear throughout the drivetrain and not just specifically one part.
So the next thing we need to do then is unbolt everything. We'll start taking the half shafts out.
Pull half shafts first and then we can get the diff out the middle without stripping all the hubs down if you wish.
Cool, okay, makes sense. And I think we'll probably take the wheels off for that then, don't we?
Can do, yes.
So we've now got the wheels off, we've got the calipers out of the way, so we can now worry about the half shafts. Now there's 5 screws holding that on, so I'll undo those first of all. Thank you, sir. And then you can actually then draw them out of the axle. Well, this is going to take a bit of a tap, I suppose, is it?
Yeah, a little tap with it.
So here we go, so just pull this out. Well, the first thing is it's in one piece, that's good.
Yes.
Now looking at the splines there, I mean, what are we looking for? A little bit, I suppose, a bit of chattering, a sort of a bit of wear, but it actually looks pretty reasonable first up.
Wear.
Oh, there is a little bit just there, isn't there?
Not too bad though, they're very, very good. You've seen them when they're worn off, so.
Okay, so at this stage then, would you think the best thing to do is actually, do we need to replace them, or is this something we can kind of work with? Would you be happy?
We could work with those, I think.
Yeah? Now, the next bit, actually, the hub nuts there looking very rusty. There's a little bit of moisture actually on this half shaft, so there's obviously water has been an issue in its life, hasn't it?
In its pipe, yes. Yeah, there's been something in there.
Okay. Upwards and upwards. Or onwards and inwards, actually. Now, Steve, under all this rust should be 2 hub nuts and some kind of locking tab or locking wash, is that right?
Yes, yeah, there's 2 hub nuts with a lock tab in between the 2.
I think we might need a bit more of that action. Thank you, sir. Oh, that's better. So theoretically, if all the seals are working, then there should never be any chance of the water actually getting inside this, should there?
In theory, yeah, if the axle breather's up in the right place and all the seals are working correct.
That's tricky. Okay, well, there we go. So now, with the rust removed, I now need to just knock back the tab off this locking tab here, just move it away from the surface of the nut, because that's obviously what's holding it, stopping it from spinning around. Right, so now our hub nuts are off. We can now actually try and take the rest of the hub off. It's probably going to need a bit of a tap, isn't it, I guess?
I think so, yeah.
So, there we go. Not too bad. Okay. Oh, look at that. Right, pop that down there. Now, first thing, got a little spacer here, or whatever, so that's just for the nuts to sit on. So there's a seal at this end, which looks a little bit past it, to be honest.
It depends on model age, there's an outer seal as well as an inner hub seal.
Right, so this one obviously has one of those, so we'll have to replace that as well. And I guess I can't actually get anything to spin. If I spin it over. So there's another seal on this side. That looks even worse than this side. So actually we're going to have at least the 2 seals, and this is the one that's obviously letting the water back in, presumably.
Yes, yeah, that'd be the one letting the water through into the hub if it's going to.
Okay, so we need to change that as well. And theoretically, I suppose we should be able to spin the bearing or something.
We should be able to, yes, but if you can't turn them, that's not a good sign.
It's not a good sign. So obviously, I think because of the moisture, I guess, that's actually been in the axle, then it would make sense, because we're taking everything apart anyway, to change the seals and the bearings, and then that way we know it's going to be good to go back together again. Now, just looking at this stub axle here, now we obviously had a bearing that I couldn't move, and that's because it actually has pretty much seized solid. You can see, I guess, that the water's got in there. It's actually started to pit all the surfaces, and it's just gummed the whole thing up. And actually, you can see the evidence of that on the stub axle itself. So you can see there's discoloration of the metal. It's this kind of nice kind of golden brown colour here, and it actually goes into blue there. And what's happened, of course, as that bearing's been getting hot and seizing, it's actually then transferred that heat to the stub axle, actually changing the surface of the steel and therefore changing the colour. If you go a bit further along, we can actually see the surface here where the seals sort of ride on. That's all pitted and damaged, which means obviously oil can get out, but also water can get back in, which is probably what led to the bearing failing in the first place. So what that means is we're going to be changing the stub axle here, and I might as well do that on the others as well, just to make them all look lovely. Right, well, we know this side needs a bit of work. I'm guessing the other side is much the same, but I suppose we should check that as well, shouldn't we?
Yeah, we'll get the other side to pieces, and then we can get the diff out.
Lovely. Right, well, this actually looks slightly better nicked than the other side. There's less rust for a start. Didn't the bearings work? All right, that's better.
The bearing seems to work this side compared to the other, yes.
So we've got some working bearings, but still, and a little bit less moisture. But obviously, if we're changing the bearings on one side, we might as well do that on this side. Now, when it actually comes to the half shaft here, again, it's pretty much the same where, if anything, it's slightly better. So I think that probably it's fair to say that the half shafts are in good nick and we can use those again.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so the next thing we need to worry about is the differential itself. And the first thing, which I think is quite bad.
There's quite a bit of movement in there, yes.
Now, there shouldn't be any movement at all, really. You should really be...
No, none at all, no.
Imperceptible, because now this is a bit different to modern vehicles where you have a kind of a crush washer, but this has actually just got shims, is that right?
Yes, yeah, the pinion shaft is shimmed to get the preload on the bearings.
So, theoretically, if that was correct, then there wouldn't be any movement at all, which means there's something not so good with our bearings.
No, no movement at all, backwards or forwards or left to right.
So then if this is not so great, then of course it means that could there be damage then inside the diff? I mean, obviously then you've got the sort of the teeth of the various gears and things.
Depending on how long it's been like it in use, it's whether it's worn the crown wheel and pinion.
Right, okay, and then where we're going to find out about that is by getting inside.
Rip it apart.
Here we go again. Actually, we leave one on.
Yeah, we'll leave that one.
So now we're just, all the bolts are undone. What we need to do is just give it a bit of a tap, I guess, to get it to remove itself a little tiny bit. Maybe you can go a bit more butch than that.
Tapping left to right on the nose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's no risk of damaging it anymore, right?
Okay.
Still a bit, it's a bit grippy there, but that's fine. So here we go. So now, this is the whole of the differential. So you've got the pinion, you've actually got the crown wheel, so you've got the panic gears, you've got everything. So it's going to be quite heavy, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
In fact, let's move that out of the way, because otherwise we're going to crunch it. I might need to just prise it open just a little bit. Thank you. Okay. Now, should we put it onto its side, perhaps, so we can see what's going on? Right, well now, at first glance, can't see any sign of any chipped teeth, which is good. And then...
Well, the pinion bearings don't sound nice anyway, because there's a lot of play in them.
Yeah, so that's really where the problem is. And I guess, so if the teeth are sort of okay, it's actually the bearings that are definitely an issue. But obviously these are quite a complicated bits of gear. I mean, you can see this very strange looking kind of nut on the top. That's actually kind of winds in to hold the bearings in place. And there's this little thing here which actually locks that into position. There's obviously one on either side. Now the thing is, if you were to try and refurbish this at home, you'd need an awful lot of Land Rover sort of specialist tools, and particularly the main thing would be the kind of the block that supports everything, so you can actually get the height of the pinion in the right place.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you haven't got any of those, I guess that's going to set you back a fair few quid, or you're going to have to borrow them.
And guessing again might cause the diff to fail as well.
Well, that's true. If you don't get it right.
If you don't get it right, then it's either going to be noisy,
yeah,
or
fail
a lot of
work
tolerance.
Eventually. Yeah, that's very true. And I suppose to get someone else to refurbish it, it's probably going to cost you maybe £400 or so. But you guys actually do a brand new one.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do a complete reassembled unit, so off the shelf. So literally, you can put it in, rebuild the axle, put the oils in, and away to go. That's
brilliant. And of course, then you have the peace of mind that it's been set up exactly the way it should be, obviously with no sloppiness, shall we say, like we have here. So that's possibly the way to go with this back axle. So now we should have a little look at the front axle, see how things are going there. Right, so this is our front axle, and it's pretty much identical to the rear axle, except for these swivel joints at either end. Of course, that's how you go around corners, that's how you steer, and you've got a CV joint kind of right in the middle of this sphere. Now, you can see it hasn't actually got any protection on there, but that's actually as it is from factory, isn't it? That's how it's supposed to be.
Yes, it is, yeah.
So obviously the problem is that when the seals start to wear away, when sand and grit get in there, of course, as you can see, there's all kinds of oil beginning to leak out, and that's obviously less than ideal. But while it's all still in one piece, something else that's worth talking about is that there's this bearing at the top and the bottom, and basically that swivel action, if you like, that's the kingpin inclination, and that's basically what defines your caster angle, isn't it? So that's effectively what helps control or bring you back to straight when you're going around a corner. Now, John had actually fitted a 2-inch lift kit to his vehicle, which effectively pushes the axles down away from the bodywork. But because of this hockey stick, this lump of suspension here, as it's being pushed down to get a bit more height, of course, it's also changing the angle or the orientation of the axle. And therefore, it's also changing that inclination, which means you lose a little bit of caster. So one thing we need to think about in the future is perhaps uprating those, so we can actually, because you do like a corrective
caster, yes, on the hockey sticks.
So it adds about, what, 3 degrees or something?
3 degrees, yeah.
So that way, hopefully then John's handling has been much better on the road on the way to the off-road adventure. But anyway, enough of that. Let's crack on with taking this apart. So essentially, it's much the same as the other side, but you've got, rather than a half shaft there, that's here, is that right?
Yes, yeah.
Your CV joint, and then you've got, what,
a stub shaft.
A stub shaft, right, okay, we've got a stub shaft at the edge there, and so we're going to have to take it all apart again, so it's the same bolts on there, and then slowly remove it, and so we can see the condition of everything inside. Right then, well, looking at our little stub shaft here, so the spline is basically the same sort of thing we had on the half shaft on the rear, and you can see there's just a little bit of wear, just like before, but nothing too serious, so we can definitely use this again, so that's great. So now the next bit is to take off the rest of this hub. So again, as before, we have these two nuts and the washer. Right, so now, I can maybe tease this off again. A little bit of persuasion. Right, so, now again, much the same sort of story as on the rear end there. We've got the seals are clearly not actually stopping the oil leaving, so that's good. We're going to have to change all those bearings. Ooh. Actually, not quite as bad as the back. I haven't seized, that's for sure. But again, it would be worth changing those as well. So now, the next thing you need to do is actually start to try and separate this swivel joint here. Right, so get rid of that. And then we actually get to our CV joint, which is in here. There we go. So this actually looks in pretty good order. Main thing to do is just check the cage for any cracks. So everything's looking pretty reasonable, and it's actually quite tight, which is good. Now, this is an earlier model of Range Rover. On the later ones, they actually have that stub shaft attached to the CV joint, which is then in turn actually attached to the half shaft. So it would all come out in one go. So in a weird way, this is slightly easier to deal with. Right, with that out of the way, the next thing is to now undo the back of this. I can get it off the swivel joint. So last screw there, and then this little metal kind of plate comes off. And then you can see just about, there is underneath all this muck actually a seal. So what I need to do is actually get that seal out. Obviously it's not really doing a great job anyway, because you can see there's oil everywhere. So what I'm going to try and do without damaging it too far or too much, I'm just going to tap that in. Try that again. There we go, so that's the seal removed. So the only thing that's actually holding the swivel housing onto the inside of the swivel joint is actually the bearings going top and bottom, and thankfully I can just undo just the top one and bottom, so I'm just going to have to just fold that flat here. This little locking tab goes onto that bolt, and then we should be able to undo those and then remove the bearing. Right, there we go. So that is the pin, and the bearing actually sits on top of that. So now we should be able to lever the housing over. So you're revealing the bearing, it drops off the bottom. So you can see, obviously one bearing's there, the other one is actually going in to the top. So we're now actually into our swivel, which doesn't look terrible, it's got to be said. I mean, the bearings have got a little bit of pitting on. again, seen better days, easy enough bits to replace as well. So another thing to the list. So the last part now is our half shaft. Look at that. And so again, looking here, so looking at this at our half shaft, again, same sort of story. There's a little tiny bit of wear, but it really isn't that bad after 100,000 miles. So I think we'll keep that one as well. Right then, so the last thing to undo is actually our swivel joint itself. Now these are normally Loctited in, so it's a little bit tighter than it might be, but it's okay. So it does come apart reasonably well. I guess it's because of all the leaks. There's oil everywhere, so all the threads aren't actually seized in, so that's kind of handy. So a few of these to do, and then we're nearly there. Now while I wrestle with these screws, actually what's interesting is you can see that this coating here is actually chrome plated. Obviously it's nice and hard and it kind of resists quite a bit of wear, but it's obviously not very good for the environment. So sort of after about 2012 or so, they started using a nitrate finish. It was kind of like a black finish, and that is obviously slightly better for the environment. So you can actually age the vehicle, or certainly age the swivel joint, by what colour it is. Now, a little tap, hopefully. There we are. So now that is a swivel joint, you can see right there. Now, first of all, you can actually see there's an inclination that way. So actually it gets to the kind of the centre of the contact patch of the tyre. So that actually stops any kind of weirdness in handling that way. But also, if you can imagine, then depending on the orientation of the axle, also depends on the caster angle, which is why we have to compensate for that lift kit. Now, I'll just remove the seals and that little plate. Now, Steve, I can see some pitting here, so that doesn't look great, does it? So I guess the chrome's actually coming away.
Starting to go, isn't it? That's actually inside the seal, so there's been water in the oil, which has been causing that.
And of course, once you've got that run of rough surface, then the seal's going to get snagged. It's going to let more moisture in and more oil out.
Yeah.
So, okay, so we need a new one of those as well.
Yep.
Do you do a kit for this?
Yes, there's a swivel kit, yes.
Brilliant. That's very, very handy, isn't it? So there we go. So it looks like, as far as the swivel joints are concerned, we may well end up replacing both of those, but actually the half shafts are okay and the stub shafts are all right, as the CV joint seems to be as well. So that's all good. So the last thing we need to worry about on this thing, of course, is our differential again. So on this end, I mean, like there's quite a lot of backlash. There's more, I would say,
more backlash than that one feels than on the other one.
And there's a little bit of movement as well, sort of fore and aft. Not as much as on the rear, but it can't be great. But also it kind of, it seems to change depending on where you are, which means, does that mean something's bent?
Might be something within the taper roller on the bearing, but I wouldn't have thought you'd bend the pinion shaft.
You'd have to be going some, wouldn't you, really?
You'd break it first before it bend.
Okay, but it's not a great thing. So yes, I suppose we should undo this and have another look and just see what the inside of our diff looks like, and then I think we know pretty much where we are with our axles. Yep.
Should just roll, I think.
Oh, look at that. Beautiful. Beautiful. Yep. Right, so just 10 more bolts to undo, and then we'll know what's going on the inside. Okay. Right then. Hopefully no oil is going to leak out of this as we're doing it vertically, but we might have a little bit, might we? Right then, so this is quite heavy. So here we go again. It's all that quality iron, isn't it? Let's have a look. Like so. Oh no. There's quite a lot of movement there. Well, so again, looks a bit like the rear axle. I can't see any broken teeth. I guess it looks all right inside here. But there's a lot of backlash.
There's a lot more backlash in this one, I think, than the front.
And I suppose, again, I mean, obviously because of that play, You're going to have to take it all apart.
You'll take it all apart.
Reshim it.
Yeah, redo the pinion bearings again in this one, because this one, there's risk play in the bearings, and it seems to go, has that tight spot as well, so we've got to investigate the tight spot.
So probably, it's again, nice and easy just to use a Brit part. Well, that was quite a job, but thanks to Steve's help, we now know which part of our original axles need to be discarded and which can be salvaged. So the next part of the process is to get the casings, which we are going to keep, shot blasted and then powder coated so they look as good as new. So I'm going to leave those with Steve, but I'm not going to leave empty-handed, because I also can now take away with me things like the bearings, the seals, brakes, differentials, all the other stuff we need to build up those axles so they're good and ready to go onto the chassis. And clearly, that's going to be quite a bit of work. So it's a job for another day and a job for back at the workshop. A while back, I asked you guys whether we should scrap or fix up John's Range Rover chassis. After obviously tons of consideration, most of you came back with scrap it, which is rather rude. Which is why we're here at Britpart, because they have a whole range of brand new chassis available, but also we can talk to Paul and Steve, some experts, to find out whether we really should actually buy a new one or actually just fix this one up. So what's the verdict, boys?
Okay.
It's definitely savable. It's not destined for the scrap heap just yet.
I mean, where do we start? I guess the thing is, obviously we've lasered the outside. It was a nice little experiment to see whether we could actually clean away the rust, first of all. And I think it's actually done a pretty good job in places, but I'm sure you're going to have something to say about that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, what lasering has done is shown us that the structure of a chassis is very solid. It's actually a very good chassis still, so definitely repair it rather than replace it.
That's good, okay. And Steve, do you concur with that?
It's definitely savable. It's not destined for the scrap pile yet.
Okay, that's cool. So then what about, I mean, obviously the next process for us is going to be thinking about galvanizing, because I want it looking nice and shiny, just like the ones behind us. For that surface, you know, do we need to do any more treatment to this, or are we happy as it is?
I think what we'd recommend is to actually shot blast it after the lasering, because it's left in areas like this. We still have under seal, which it hasn't burnt off.
Yeah.
And
I guess also these sort of polished surfaces it's almost like brand new metal, possibly too slippery.
It will give it an etch, and it will give the galving something to adhere to. But yes, I think we've got to get it cleaned up again. And there's a few localised repairs to do, such as
that's the other
rear
thing.
cross member.
Now, obviously, I mean, if we decided that we actually couldn't be bothered with the work, can we just go and buy one of your chassis? I guess you sell a few of these, looking at the massive pile behind us. Do you do some for a 1986 Range Rover?
No, we don't have them on the shelf. The bulk of the chassis we sell are 90 or 110s, and the Range Rover Classic, the steel in the Range Rover Classic chassis has always been really good. So bizarrely, we don't rust away anything like as much as a Defender.
Well, that's actually good to know. So it's not actually so much because the quality, you know, the fact that it's there because the quality is good, not because people just don't want a 1986 Range Rover. That's good.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Cool, okay. So, and then if we were to get one, I mean, can you have one made? Or, I mean, are they quite expensive? Or?
Sure, yeah. I mean, we can get one made. It would be a special order. You're probably looking 2 or 3 months to get it. And it would be in the region of about £4,000.
Fine, okay. So, well, obviously we're racing ahead with this build. So obviously the 2-month thing, 4-month thing is a problem, but also the money. Let's try and keep the budget a bit down. So, okay. So it comes to then trying to sort of fix this up then. Do you actually sell any replacement panels on bits and pieces? So the bit here that's really, really rotten. I mean, you can see it's not looking good at all. Is that something that we can?
Unfortunately, not for this model, no. So that's one you've got to really fabricate yourself, which isn't too difficult. It is folded steel. So that's quite easy to do.
Okay. And other parts where we've got these sort of problems here and here, I mean, obviously where there's been sort of bracketry that's just going to be rotting the metal underneath.
Sure.
Again, we're just going to have to repair that with a big patch.
Just cut it out and let in some more metal. The outriggers are really solid on it, which is great to see, and the spring hangers and the radius arm mounts, everything like that. That's really
so the important stuff is there, which is good. And
Yeah.
it seems, I mean, it's difficult to look at. I mean, do you have a chassis jig and stuff to check whether things are straight? I mean, there's no reason why we think this might not be, but how would you normally check that sort of stuff?
We would just normally want to tape measure over it and make sure it's still square. Normally, if it's had an impact, you will see would be a bulge in the chassis rail,
Yeah.
and it'd be quite obvious that it's got a kink in it.
Okay.
I can't see any sort of evidence of accident damage on this, so
Cool. And there are some little tiny ripples, but I think that's just part of the manufacturing process where this sort of shape is pressed. And actually that's another interesting thing, because I've noticed just on the chassis behind us that it looks like the corners have been welded rather than kind of folded over. So is that actually the case?
Sure, yeah. I mean, this is an original Range Rover chassis. They've always made them the same, is that they have a C-section, so it's 2 pieces of metal welded down the middle here.
Yeah.
For the aftermarket chassis, they actually weld them down a corner. So it's actually 4 pieces of metal stitched together.
Right. So it's a lot easier to make, but obviously not anywhere near as strong.
Correct. I mean, the tools for making these legs is massively expensive.
Yeah.
With these, they're laser cut out and then welded together. So there's a difference in the construction of it.
Okay. So it's another really good reason to try and keep this rather than perhaps go for a new one.
Absolutely, yeah. This will be the ultimate chassis. If we can get it rebuilt and strong enough, it's going to be the way to go forward.
Well, you heard it here first. The experts are telling us that we are going to actually fix it up rather than scrap it and get a new one. So it's a whole load more work for us, but it's going to be better for the job. So there we go. Well then, Paul, it would seem, despite all of your negative vibes towards the chassis, and despite you lot also siding with Paul, wanting to scrap it rather than repair it, the experts say that we should actually repair and restore this chassis. It's the right thing to do.
Really? Well, I thought we could get another one made.
All right, technically we could have one custom made. It's going to cost thousands of pounds and it's going to take many months to do. And of course, we're trying to rush ahead and get this project finished.
Yeah, because time is of the essence.
That's very cheeky, but one advantage of sticking with our chassis is it's going to be slightly stronger than a more modern one because of this C-section welded together rather than the 4 pieces welded together. And because he does like to get stuck in with his off-roading, a little bit of extra strength will be a bonus. And the good news about this chassis is there doesn't seem to be any signs of any accident damage.
And that's because John's done it all on purpose.
And the bad news, unfortunately, is there are loads and loads of repairs we're going to have to do.
Can we get any repair panels?
Unfortunately, none are available, so we're going to have to fabricate everything ourselves. Now,
Okay.
obviously, this area around here where the fuel tank, the back of the chassis, I mean, that's probably the worst part of the whole chassis, and we're just going to literally have to cut it away and replace it with brand new metal.
Yeah, maybe we should make a jig first so we know where the petrol tank brackets are.
That's a good idea, because it would be good to get them in the right place.
Well, I think it'd help.
But there's also lots of little bits. I mean, like you can see this bit here on the sort of the shock mount here, you've actually got a little bit of a hole, so we are going to have to replace that tube. Perhaps we could repair it, but I think we're going to have to replace it. We've got things like that where there's actually a bolt that's sheared off. We're going to have to replace that.
I can
and
see
have to
that.
get in there for that.
There's like a captive nut in here as well.
Right, so we have to sort of add those in. There's a whole little section of metal missing just there.
Yeah, well, we've got kind of a pattern on the other side here.
Okay, that's cool. And then, I mean, as we get towards the front of the vehicle, for some reason it's slightly better nick. I guess he left it parked in a puddle all the time. But you can see here, there's kind of where the surface really is quite pitted. In fact, you can see little pin pricks there.
Yeah,
we're going to have to
that's
definitely
pretty bad.
Replace that all together. Now, we've always known that the chassis needs a bit of work, but perhaps the most frustrating news,
Yep.
the Britpart boys obviously also agree with you lot out there that we're going to have to shop blast this, because obviously although the laser cleaning did quite a good job and it's lasted quite well over the months I've just been leaving it here, obviously because we've got shiny bits and rusty bits, we are actually going to have to get a nice even key for the galvanizing to stick uniformly. So we are going to have to get it shop blast anyway, but ignoring the outside for a moment, we also have to worry about the rust on the inside of the chassis.
Wow, look at all this mud in here. I wonder how much rust that's hiding.
Well, that is the problem. So obviously we're going to have to get rid of all this off-roading filth that John has been collecting over the years before we can do anything else on the inside of that chassis. And that is actually quite a small hole. And the other thing is on the other end, at the front of the chassis, there are 2 blanking plates kind of covering up our axis as well. So I think we might just cut those off before we then try and get a nice free passage all the way through to get rid of all that dirt and grime.
Well, I'll tell you what, you crack on with that and I'll go and make a cup of tea.
Fair enough. Now you can see at the front of the chassis here we have these 2 blanking plates. Now obviously the bumper attaches onto here, so I don't know why they've blanked these off but not at the other end at the back. But to give myself good access all the way through the chassis, I'm actually just wanted to remove these. Now you can see there's a little bead of weld all the way around. I think what I'm going to try and do, before I start cutting it off, I'm actually just going to grind that back and see if I can get an idea of where the seam is and then try and ease it off just so I damage as little of the original chassis as possible. Now that is a bit of a nightmare. I was hoping that once I'd remove this little piece of metal, I'd have much better access to the inside of the chassis. But you can see I've got these two spaces there, obviously to support the bolts or the load of the bumper, and also another plate behind that. Now there's a fair chunk of mud in there, so at least I can get to that. But it's going to be a lot harder to clean this out than I was originally thinking. So now I will do the same to the other side just to get the mud out. But I'm going to have to come up with a plan B when it comes to actually trying to flush the whole of this chassis out.
Yeah, I made you a nice cup of tea.
Oh, thank you, sir. Perfect timing.
What are you doing?
Well, we have a little bit of a problem because I've cut those little end caps off the chassis and established now that there is no way we're going to get the mud out from that end, really,
Okay,
because
yep.
there's so many other tubes and stuff in there. Gave me an idea. I've done a little bit of bracketeering.
Okay.
And what I'm hoping now is we can now, having to sort of attach this little tube to the chassis with a bracket. It's temporary, so that's
Yeah,
okay. So
nice
we can
job.
then maybe lift that up,
Yep.
rotate it, and then twat it with some hammers and then persuade the mud out gently.
Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, it might work. Well, I think that is pretty much all we're going to get out of this for the moment, isn't it? That's not bad, is it?
Look at the mud.
That's, I mean, that's pretty
Unbelievable.
crazy. That's a lot of John's off-roading filth right there. But let's have a little look and see how well we're doing. You see that? We've got like a little baffle.
Oh, wow.
So there's basically a plate of metal in here, a kind of a funny angle. I've no idea why it's there. I guess, you know what, it looks like it's only welded on one side. So do you think they welded them all in before they put all the C-section together?
Maybe it's to stop the section going too close together.
That would make sense. So it would seem that there's these little bits of metal, presumably, annoyingly, all the way through the chassis just to keep it the right distance when they welded up. And I think, I mean, it's very hard to say.
Why don't I grab the endoscope?
Yes.
And we can put that
Yeah,
down there.
do that. That's a good idea. So yeah, so we'll get the endoscope and have a little look and just see, because it looks like there might be another one. I can just see a little bit, and again, it looks like it's welded on the inside and not the outside. So we'll see if we can get that to work. Let's have a look. Well, we've got it on. Right, so first of all, you can see there's the plate in the background. So if I now go a bit further down, you can see there is some kind of light at the end of the tunnel, but there is definitely another plate right there. So that is going to be a problem. So there's probably those things running all the way through the chassis. But let's try the other end and see what's going on. Well, if we have a look at this end, you can see again, these are the two tubes I revealed when I cut the end plates off. And they're just obviously just to give it a bit more sort of meat when you're bolting things on. Again, there's one of these baffle plates with two holes in. So if we just pop our endoscope into that. Let's have a little look. So there's quite a lot of dirt in there. Oh, there we go. And then there's our next reinforcing tubes. There and there. And if we go in between the middle of them, there's another plate, yeah, with another 2 holes in. So technically we could probably push past that dirt and into the next section. But clearly these little gussets are going all the way through the length of the chassis. And that means that probably we have banged out all the mud that we can. We're just going to have to use something else to get to the rest of it. And I think maybe water might be the answer. Well, this must mean it's time for a bid of the week, sponsored by H&H.
So why are we on a boat?
Well, I'm glad you asked. The next classic car auction is going to be at the Imperial War Museum at Duxford Aerodrome, and it's going to be on the 19th of October. And it's going to contain something rather special.
Okay.
The Robert Riding collection is up for auction, and all of those cars are actually going to have no reserve. The proceeds are going to go to the RNLI.
Hence why we're in the boat.
Exactly.
So that's a really good gesture for a really good cause.
It really is, and the Royal National Lifeboat Institution are largely made up of volunteers, so of course they need all the funds they can get to pay for that equipment and all that good work.
Of course they do.
And you really hope that those are the guys that are going to turn up if you find yourself in trouble at sea. Too, or at least you anyway, because I'll be able to probably walk to the shore.
That's for sure.
So have you had a look through the catalogue yet?
Yeah, it was a really nice 1962 Triumph TR3B.
Okay.
Finished in ice blue.
Nice.
With a nice burgundy interior.
Oh, that's a good combination.
And it benefits from the larger 2138cc engine mated to a fully synchromesh gearbox, which was rebuilt with new pistons and liners. Also benefits from a fast road camshaft and a Kenlow fan.
Wow.
And the car was recently imported from the USA to the UK in 2018. It's got a guide price of between £16,000 and £20,000.
Okay, that sounds like a lot of coffee money.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
So something I'm going to be keeping an eye on. What about yourself?
There's a whole load of cars I've seen on the catalogue which I quite like. I think the guy had fantastic taste, frankly, because I like all of his cars. But there was definitely the orange beach buggy. That's rather lovely.
Oh, definitely.
Rather neat.
Orange and a beach buggy.
Exactly. What more could you want?
Yeah.
There's a Bentley S1, which is a rather lovely
okay.
car, so that'd be quite fun. But actually, perhaps my favourite thing in this whole collection is the 1925 Bentley.
That sounds absolutely fantastic.
Been in the family for 82 years, bought
Wow.
just before the war. It's got a wonderful patina on the bodywork. It's clearly had a bit of fun while driving it around, but it just looks all lovely and original, which is quite special. And the estimate for it is 160 to 180,000.
Wow, I need to look out for that one.
You do, and maybe mortgage the house.
Yeah, maybe I'll look under the bed for some more money.
Might even be worth selling a kidney for.
Sounds like a great auction, one I daren't miss.
Well, actually, while you're down there, perhaps go for an extra day because H&H have got another special treat for us. It's a brand new category of auction, the Fast Road Sale.
The fast road sale?
Yes, the Fast Road Sale. Now, as you might imagine from the title, it's going to have all kinds of fast road cars, rather like this lovely Alfa Romeo Giulia Super,
Yeah, 1968 Mini Cooper S.
Porsche 911s,
Series 1 RS Turbo,
Lotus Elises,
Triumph TR7 V8.
and a Lotus 7.
Oh,
And they're going to go under the hammer on the 20th of October, again at Duxford Aerodrome. So anything you
Can't
like
wait.
there?
yeah, I've seen a really nice 1970 RS 1600 twin cam Mark 1 Escort.
Nice.
And it's absolutely gorgeous, and reputedly it was one of the Ford press and development cars.
Wow, so it's actually the real deal with some proper provenance.
The real deal, and it's got a guide price between £40,000 and £50,000. So save your pennies.
Well, it sounds like a bit of money, but actually it's an awful lot of car, isn't it?
It's an iconic car. So what have you seen?
Well, something that caught my eye was a 2014 Mitsubishi Lancer Evo 10.
Wow, didn't you test drive one of those many years ago?
I did when they'd first come out, and they've got lots of letters after the name. It's FQ440MR, which means all kinds of stuff. It's a very, very fast car. It had, I think, like 10 computers running all the various systems. So it's a very, very capable car, but blisteringly fast. And the FQ actually stands for fine quality.
So what's the guide price on that car?
85 to 100,000 pounds.
Wow, definitely going to have to go and raid the bank for that.
Well, in fact, the Evo would be exactly the right getaway car for that kind of bank job, frankly.
Absolutely.
So there are going to be loads of exciting cars to bid on, and whether you want to go fast and furious or go for a classic cruiser, get yourself down to Duxford on the 19th and the 20th for those two auctions.
Should be a great pair of auctions.
Absolutely. Right, so what I'm doing is basically just stuffing my little probe into any orifice I can find, hoping to find some dirt and cleaning it out. Do it. Go on, Paul. It's actually looking pretty clean now, which is nice.
Well, the water is certainly a lot cleaner than it was to come out.
I think so. So it looks like we've actually managed to do the job. We've managed to get all of John's horrible filth out of the inside of the chassis. Now, it would have been really lovely to be able to do something else to treat the rust inside, but I think the best thing to do next is a bit of welding and maybe a bit of galvanising.
And that's definitely a job for another day. Should we have a cup of tea? Sure.
Well, it is fair to say that this old chassis has had a bit of a hard life, but it has handled it rather well. The chassis is still nice and straight, it's nice and strong, but of course there are a few areas where the rot has started to take hold, and that is what we're going to have to deal with.
It's hardly surprising, especially the way John's been treating it.
That's a fair point. Yeah, he is a bit of a brute, it has to be said. But we can't put this off any longer. We need to dive deeper to work out exactly what we're going to have to repair. Now, there is a very slim chance that perhaps one of the reasons why we haven't got around to working on the chassis so far is because of the enormity of the thing in hand.
It's a daunting task.
It is indeed a big job for sure, and the best way to deal with a big job is to break it up into lots of little jobs, so that way you trick yourself into thinking it's nice and easy. So to that end, I've managed to raid the fridge door, got lots of little magnets, and we're going to go around the whole chassis and just stick these wherever there's a bit of work that needs to be done, and then hopefully that way it'll feel a lot easier when we just do one at a time.
Good idea.
I thought so. Actually, it's quite good at the front there, but as you come down here, it's actually much worse. You see those pinholes.
This is really bad.
Actually,
another bit of delaminating here.
Well, that's where the laser has actually kind of tried to cook through the flaky steel, but actually hasn't managed it, so that's another bit we need to do. But then it's really nice. It's really clean.
But
this is
generally, it's pretty good, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, actually, now you can see just on this side, it's actually kind of starting to blow. So if you can maybe put one on there. I'll certainly look at that later. And obviously,
yeah,
all of that. I don't
even
save
think,
that till last.
I don't think we need one on here, but
just in case. So we've got, it's in the count. It's fine.
yeah, I think this actually deserves two. Actually,
it is quite bad. I'll give you that. But then, actually, I think once we're into the groove, that won't be so difficult to do. There's another little tiny hole here. So there's obviously this tube here where we've actually got the sort of the shock hanger. If you can feel that, Paul, you can actually see there's like a kind of a little gap in the tube here.
oh, okay, yeah.
Could potentially just fill it with weld, or I could chop it out and we can actually put in a little section of round tube. We'll see how that goes. I'll pop one in there. There's like a little cutout there, but also that's stuck in place here.
Yeah, I'll put one on there.
Oh, again, and more blowing on this one here, so we'll do that. This area
And there's
here.
one here as well. This little bracket that goes on the side here.
Yeah.
This one's okay, but obviously this one's seen better days.
And then you can see here where the spring hanger's actually been attached to the chassis. All the moisture, the water and the mud have just sat there kind of rotting the steel. So we're going to have to do one there as well, I think. The difficult bit is we're going to have to either just cut that out and replace it with a new piece and then drill those holes from the other side.
I think there's tubes in here, isn't there?
There is.
Anti-crush tubes.
Yeah, exactly. Or we could mark it all out, do the holes first, and then put the plate on.
Yep.
So we'll see how we go with that. That's again, this is really nice.
But I take it back, you know, it's not as bad as I thought actually.
Good, I'm glad you're beginning to see sense.
You know, I don't want to feel too negative.
John doesn't like your negative vibes.
I know he doesn't.
You have to do some positive vibes instead. And now this one actually a bit of a shame up here. There's a bit of a corrosion. The outrigger is actually really good, obviously, because this is holding the body though. I think I'd like to see a little bit more work on there. I don't know what we're going to do, but it might be worth doing. Actually, again, the top side is looking pretty reasonable, isn't it? Well, I think that's all the kind of blemishes on this sort of orientation of the chassis. So now what we'll do is spin it around on our jig and then just go through again just to see if there's any other areas that need attention. But already it feels a little bit easier, this job, because we've got lots of little small ones rather than this one big thing to master. Yep.
Okay, here we go.
Well, actually, this side is looking quite nice already. It's very shiny at this end, except for that bit down there. Okay, that's a pain.
Wow,
So
that is bad.
it's worse on the other side, so we'll have to definitely do that. And then, actually, the outriggers are good, so that's fine. And then, oh, hello.
No, that's not very nice. Someone's been at that.
Somebody's had another go at this, haven't they?
Yeah, someone has.
Unless that's standard Jaguar welding, which I don't think it is. So it looks quite poor. So I think we may have to have a little bit of a tidy up there. But that is the
Oh dear, I
Look at
retract
that.
my last statement about how nice it was.
Is that right?
Actually, it's appalling.
Okay, that is quite bad.
Mine, that magnet doesn't actually fall through the hole.
Everything else is, you know, a little bit, still some mud in there, but other than that.
Oh, this is, look, have you seen this?
Right, well, that's my last magnet. So have you got any more?
No, but you can always borrow one from here.
Fair enough. But actually, the rest of this is looking pretty good. So obviously we've already covered that repair, which is a big one. So really, it's not too bad, just those three quite awful bits to repair there. But now we've broken this big job down into something slightly smaller, and to make my life even easier, I'm just going to start with the easiest job first.
I'll make you a cup of tea.
Thank you, sir. Now, I could have gone for any repair, but I've gone for this patch here. Although it is quite a big patch, it's a nice and simple patch. Now, there are no holes I need to line up or anything, no strange shapes that I've got to bend up. It's just nice and flat and simple. But the only thing is, you can see that the pitting is quite extensive, and if it's that bad on the outside, it also could be quite bad on the inside, particularly when you see how thin the metal is around the pinholes. And that really just influences the way I'm going to think about actually making my patch. Now, there are two ways I could approach this when it comes to making up the patch. I could make the patch up first and then cut the hole to suit, having marked it out. Or in this case, I think it might be more sensible to actually make the hole first, because I don't really know how far that rust is going to extend to. Once I know I've definitely got rid of all of the rust in the area, I can then make the patch to suit the hole. So the good news with this is that the rails, these corners here, these radiuses, are actually really, really strong and firm. There's no rot there, which is good because that's really the bit that holds the chassis together. So what I'll do is I'll mark out as far inward of these radiuses as I can to get those rails there. And then you can see on this edge here and this edge here, that's probably roughly where I'm going to cut. But this is where I need to see really what's going on underneath before I know exactly how far that hole is going to extend. And the hole, obviously it's easier to cut a square or a rectangle because of course with a guillotine perhaps it's easy, but also with an angle grinder you can kind of do any shape. So I might again try and maximise the amount of original metal that I leave in our chassis. I'm just looking for the edges of the steel. And obviously I'm going to tear into this with the grinder, so it doesn't have to be super accurate particularly. And also, I guess, cutting a little bit less off the first time is probably better. You can always add more hole. Might just. It's quite nice about with the laser actually. It's removed so much of the paint and stuff. I can really see what's going on with the metal itself. Right. Let's get. Well, you can see there is quite a bit of rust in there. And if you look at the pinholes, they are definitely as bad as I thought. And what's interesting is where the metal is actually thinner, because of course it's going through to the other side, it's actually weirdly thicker because that's called rust jacking. So the iron oxide is actually expanding. It can expand to as much as 10 times the original steel's thickness. So literally this 2.5mm plate could end up being about an inch thick if we'd let the rust carry on regardless. But also interestingly, around the outside here, the corrosion isn't actually that bad. So I probably could have got away with making a slightly smaller patch, because although there is surface rust there, it's still pretty solid. But on the outside, that pitting really had taken a hold. So this is, it seems, the right amount of metal to remove. And certainly the edges are really nice and solid. So that's going to make a great weld when I put my new piece back in. And the nice thing is I can actually use this piece as my template. Right then, so I'm going to use this rusty patch for my pattern, and I've got myself some steel. It's about 2.5mm, which is pretty much the same thickness that the chassis metal is made out of, so I'm basically going to replace like for like. And what I'm going to try and do here is just use this nice long edge against a long edge of my metal just to make my life a little bit easier, one less thing to cut. And then I'm just going to use a nice fine pen just to mark around this. Obviously any discrepancies I will be able to sort of get around with the MIG welder because it is quite forgiving. But I might as well get it close to start with. There's a little bit on the back there. So I now have the bit I need to cut around, but bear in mind this is actually already pretty much exactly the right size because I want a tiny gap between the old metal and the new metal so I get really good penetration with the welding. And because of the thickness of the disc here, these cutting discs, I love using these. They're 1mm cutting discs, normally designed for stainless steel, but actually they're brilliant for accurate cutting in all kinds of other metals. And so because that's 1mm thick, of course this is 1mm smaller than the hole I've got to fill. Well, when I've now marked out, the pen is now on the outside of that. So I just want to make sure that I'm going to put some tape right on the line of that black line there so it's easier to see when I'm actually got the sparks flying everywhere, cutting around it. And then that way, hopefully, I'll end up with a new piece exactly the same size as this, which gives me the best possible penetration when I then try and weld it back into the chassis. See if it fits. Right then, so I've now prepared the edge of that surface, so of course got rid of any extra rust, got through to the nice bright bit of steel. So now, just using a magnet, I can now hold this just in the middle here and just sort of start to see whether it's going to fit. And then, with some more magnets, I'll just pop them at the corners. It's just a really handy way of making sure that everything is in the right place, right position, and I've got a nice gap that's even all around. I can then spot it in position, and then get on with the welding. But it doesn't hurt to get this exactly right before we get all gung-ho. And obviously there's some places where I haven't got it quite right, where perhaps the gap is slightly bigger than other places, but that's all going to be fine. That's the joy of MIG, because it will definitely look after me there. So I think we're pretty good. Might have a little tap here, because obviously where it's been formed before, it's been distorted. You can see there's all these ripples we have. So we've actually managed to remove some of those by removing this panel. Little tap here, I think will make that even better. Lovely, it's flush everywhere. Now, because I'm MIG welding, I'm also relying on a flow of electrons to make my spark, so it's really important that I get a really good earth. So I just use the grinder to cut through any corrosion, any paint. So then, when I connect my earth, I'm going to make sure that those electrons flow very nicely. Another good tip is to make sure that your earth point is as close to your work where you're welding as possible. Although, to be fair, on a chassis as big as this and hopefully as conductive as this, you can probably get away with a slightly further distance. Right then, so I've now tacked it into position. I've made sure as I've gone that I've got it nice and flush. Obviously as the heat goes in, things are going to move around, but it starts out flush, there's a better chance it's going to finish nice and flush. So now I can remove my magnets and really get down to welding. Right, and so just started welding around. I'm not doing a whole seam, just doing stitches, just that way I won't put so much heat into the job. Even though it's quite thick steel, obviously I want to minimise any distortion. Once it's nice and cool to the touch, I'll carry on. Right then. Well, could have been better, could have been a lot worse. The proof will be in the pudding. So the next stage is just to grind it nice and flush with everything else and see if we can actually still see the repair. Right, well, that's looking pretty good. And once it's been galvanised, maybe a little touch of paint as well, you'll never know we've been here. Right, so 1 down, another 12 to go. Well, we have really opened a huge can of tin worm with these 2 bump stop mount repairs. Now obviously they looked pretty rusty before. You could see there was obviously some corrosion going on, but actually it's far worse than we first thought. We kind of investigated, cut a few chunks out. You can see there's massive holes in there for a start, and then when I actually cut the bracket off, you can see it's really distorted. It's kind of expanded as the rust itself has expanded, as it's been rotting. And having cut even further inside, you can actually see why. So now I've peeled up that metal. You can see inside there some of the structure that reinforces the 2 sections of the chassis, but you've also got these other bits of reinforcing metal. So you've got the 2 layers of the chassis kind of overlapping, then you've got these bits of reinforcement, then you've got also another bit of packing was stuck in there as well, and then of course you then got the mount itself for that bump stop. And because all those layers of metal are just sitting there waiting to rot, at the moment John drives through a big puddle, that water's going to go into that very convenient hole. Those layers are going to get nice and moist and they're going to start fizzing away. Now I've managed to cut away all of that rot. I can now start welding it all back together again. Well, this really was a monster repair in the end. Obviously, I got the chassis all back together again, and then I had to start thinking about reconstructing. And it's a very important area because it does quite a bit of work. Obviously, John's made some new brackets here for these bump stops. This is where the body is actually supported. So the body is attached to this part, but it's supported under here for the boot. So obviously put something really heavy like John's wallet in there, for example, then obviously these are going to start doing quite a bit of work. But also you've got the area here which is supporting the top of the spring. So this had all kind of rotted away, so I had to replace that as well. But now the last detail for this particular area is of course the bump stop mount itself. Now the original one is pretty shot. It could perhaps be salvaged, but it might be much tidier to actually make a new one from scratch. But as it turns out, I may have found the only part you can actually get to repair a chassis of this particular Range Rover year, and it's one of these, and it only costs £8. I thought I'd splash out and buy the pair. But now it's all good to go, so just get on to the next one. Well, I've saved the best until last. Well, obviously, it's the worst until last. This rear cross member is the thing that's been kind of waking me up in cold sweats in the middle of the night. But actually, now we've cleaned it and lasered it, you can see exactly what's going on, and it actually isn't anywhere near as bad as I first thought. Now, the cross member itself is obviously holding the ends of the chassis together, making sure they're nicely rigidly located, and that matters because the body is attached to the outriggers on just either side of this. But also, you've got this point here where the tow bar attaches to, and then this bit here also holds the fuel tank, which sort of sits in this space here. Now, the rear part of the cross member is made up of a sort of folded flat bit of steel. It's rolled and rolled and rolled, and all those folds end up making this nice complicated shape, and it's got a nice welded seam on the back, but that means they can actually hide inside there a little bit of strength to actually stop the crushing of this member when you bolt down the tow bar. So the bit that looks really awful, the reason I was so worried about this bit is all this sort of rust on the front here, but actually it turns out this is also made out of two folded bits of metal that have been welded on to this rear beam. So because the rear beam is nice and solid, it's good to go, I only have to fix these two bits on the front. So the good news is all I actually have to do is replace this rusty old bracket with a brand new one which will fabricate here. So obviously I'm going to use what's left of this to give you those critical dimensions, but perhaps the most critical dimensions are these bolt positions here, because of course they hold the fuel tank into our chassis, and if I get this slightly wrong, then they may be too close to the body and bang on that, or they may be hanging too low and then get into all those rocks that John's going to be driving over. So I need to make a jig to be absolutely sure that these bolts are going to end up at exactly the right position. Oh, hello, sir.
Hello, Ed. I thought I'd bring you a libation.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's coming on then.
It was actually going surprisingly well. In fact, your timing is impeccable because you could be measuring up this little bracket while I make the jig.
Sounds like a plan, but we're having our coffee first.
Fair enough.
By the way, have you seen the H&H catalogue?
I have indeed. That's a good point. It's time for Bid of the Week, sponsored by H&H Classic Auctions. And their next one is on the 30th of November at Pavilion Gardens in Buxton. There's some great cars, aren't there?
Oh, fantastic.
I've seen a couple of Bentleys. There's also a Dodge Charger in bright orange, which is rather lovely.
I saw that one.
It's very nice. And I have to say, there's one thing I'm always a bit of a sucker for, is a Jensen Interceptor. And there's a Mark II from 1971, one of 696 ever made, which is quite exciting. And it's basically got this wonderful 6.2 litre Chrysler V8. It's in gunmetal grey. You've got the biscuit leather interior, and the estimate is £45,000 to £55,000.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything you've seen?
I quite like the 1999 Aston Martin V8 Coupe.
It's a good car. That's a great car, actually. Yes, indeed. Now, that's done, I think, 29,000 miles from new. It's all warranted. It's actually one of 101 ever made. It's got the brilliant 5.3 litre V8, 32 valve engine. It's got 350 brake horsepower, 369 pounds-feet of torque, and it'll do 0 to 60 in 5.9 seconds with a top speed of about 155 miles an hour. And this is supposed to be a touring car, not a racing car, but it's got an estimate of 75 to 85,000 pounds.
But it's in green. I won't be blind.
That's a good reason, I like that. Well, if you don't like a green car, how about a nice metallic orange car? Much better. There's a wonderful Renault Alpine A110. It's a lovely little car. It's fitted with a slightly larger 1420cc engine with a big valve head, forged pistons and forged conrods, and it's good for about 130 to 135 brake horsepower, and it's one of 908, and its estimate is 55 to 65,000 pounds. So, you know, if you've got a few spare quid, go for one of those.
Yeah, but it's getting into the thing.
That is true, fair enough.
A lot to bid for then.
There is indeed. So get yourselves down to Pavilion Gardens at Buxton on the 30th of November. Should we crack on and do some actual chassis work?
If we have to. Finish the rear tank mount.
Oh, that's looking nice and smart. Fantastic. Well, I've just finished the jig. So theoretically, once we've removed all the rust, put your new parts back into position, this should locate our holes in exactly the right position.
Great.
So, as it is your chassis, shall we maybe give you the honour of cutting off the last bit of rust?
Yeah, what is a gas axe?
I was thinking we could use a plasma cutter.
Oh, great. First time I've ever used a plasma cutter on my Range Rover.
Yeah, well, what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, it'll end up like a bobtail.
Done. To make the gargantuan task of actually repairing John's rusty Range Rover chassis slightly easier, we broke it down into smaller jobs. We started with 13, found a few more along the way, but now we've actually done it. We have finished the repairs, and now the chassis is back to full strength and fit for purpose. And this is a pivotal moment, because now we're no longer taking the car apart, we are now going to start to put it back together again. The next job is to make sure that the steel doesn't rust again in the future, but that is a job for another day.
Thanks for stopping by the workshop. If you enjoyed the video even just a little bit, then click like. If you hated it, well then click like 3 times. Also remember to leave your thoughts and your questions in the comments. And obviously we'd love to see you again soon, so please remember to click subscribe if you haven't already, and click the bell for notifications of when the next video is published or when I have some intriguing news.